Hi, thanks for joining me out in the garden today. We are in the beginning of January. Happy New Year, everybody. And we finally have a cold day. I say cold. The high today is 66, so in the sun, it's actually really gorgeous right now. But our cool weather crops are really enjoying this little cold snap. We're going to be back up into the 70s by tomorrow, and then down in the 60s for most nights this week. So not too cold, but it was a nice little way to start off the new year on this Monday. We have so many things happening out in the garden. Round 2 veggies are going to be the topic for today, and also we're going to do some harvesting together. So here we go. I wanted to start off over here. You know, our Swiss chard and our greens are just these cool weather crops that just love the cold. But you know what? They're heat tolerant as well. So the chard and the greens we can grow pretty much all year round. It's just the summertime that they can start to get a bit bitter. But this chard is, as you can see, is very full. We harvest from it every week. So when I harvest it, I'm going to come in and just take these outer, longer, taller, or leaves, the more mature ones, because the longer leaves like this stay in the garden, the more depth of flavor or kind of bitter they can get. So the smaller and the younger the leaves, kind of the sweeter, more mild of a flavor that your greens will have. And as we've talked about, our tomatoes and our peppers, these are heat-loving plants. So no matter how much love, nutrients, and sunlight we give them, these cold nights have absolutely taken their toll. But it's really interesting to see the way that it affects different varieties. So right here we have our bell pepper. And you'll recall from last week's video that we did that awesome revitalized treatment. So he actually has all of these buds coming in, all of these brand new flower buds that we're so excited to see in here. And those weren't here last week, but you can see this is a bell pepper and this is a lunchbox pepper plant. The leaves are flatter and longer, and this plant has experienced less stress than our bell pepper, who in the cold, and this usually happens from too much moisture, but it's actually happening this time of season from the cold. These leaves are curling up and curling in. Do you see those curled leaves? Okay, so that's happening because it's simply going through a Florida winter. But as you can see, we have treatments and things that we can do. That's why that revitalized treatment from last week was so super important, because we wouldn't have these buds. I haven't seen buds on this pepper plant in weeks. But the also very interesting thing is that this variety, the bell, as opposed to the lunchbox pepper, which is a smaller pepper, still a sweet pepper as well, the lunchbox pepper has continued to produce this whole time. Like, I just have peppers I'm harvesting multiple times a week, and they just still keep coming. So you can see I've got these lovely peppers over here on this side as well. Okay, so it's really interesting how different varieties, you know, not only peppers are affected, but within the peppers, different varieties are going to behave different ways. And then let's go ahead and get to our tomatoes. So our beefsteak tomatoes are the ones that are going to stop producing first when it gets too cold and when it gets too hot. So what's happened with mine is I have a bunch of large tomatoes, but they're having a hard time ripening because of these cold nights. So what I'm going to do is harvest 50% of the tomatoes that are of size, because as we talk about all the time, right, we can go ahead and harvest these tomatoes. Look at this baby, perfect size. We can go ahead and harvest them and put it on the countertop. When it's this green, it might take up to 2 weeks to ripen, but when it does, it'll be delicious. They're so good. We're just not used to seeing tomatoes this way, because when we get them from the grocery store, they're all perfectly red, or at least supposed to be. But that's not the way veggies are. It's just fine to harvest it while it's green. Or you can do a little fried green tomatoes or some green verde salsa and enjoy that as well. So I'll be doing that today. And you know, I just want to draw attention a little bit to the lack of the leaves on the bottom half of the beefsteak plant. So Next to the beefsteak is a cherry tomato plant, which is in much better shape at this point in the season. We have had a little bit of dryness in the garden, but what really happens to a tomato plant, you know, over either the winter, you know, the cold of the winter, and it's a heat-loving plant, or in Florida, the heat of the summer, because in July and August, it gets too hot for these, especially the beefsteak tomatoes, to produce as well. The tomato plant has been through a lot, okay? This is why we replace our tomato plants every 6 months, because I wouldn't want to take a plant that's been through a tough season, whether it be the cold or the heat, into the next season and think I'm really going to get the greatest yield and production out of it. So it's just a great example of why we go ahead and replace our tomatoes. But you can see they're still producing and we are in good shape for the upcoming season. The cilantro is doing beautifully. We're going to harvest a bunch of cilantro. When I harvest cilantro, I just talk about giving it a little haircut. So what I do, take some of the longest leaves, hold them in my finger like this, boop, and put that right into my harvest bag. Now you can go ahead and go back in, and if there are any bare branches that are sticking up that just have no leaves on them, cut those back. But that's just a quick way to harvest a whole bunch of cilantro. All right, oh my goodness, look at these lovely collards. So we are moving on to the round 2 portion of the season. And for round 2, we are going to be replacing a lot of the plants that are in the garden. Again, so fortunate in Florida to be able to grow veggies practically 12 months out of the year. However, right, halfway through the season, my kale has been harvested so much that it's growing up. You know what, it's gonna kind of fall out of the garden here by next month. So next month, do I want a kale that's falling out of the garden? Or do I want to go ahead and put in a round 2 kale that I'll keep harvesting from clear into March when I replant for the spring? So that's what I mean by round 2. You kind of have to make the decision, veggie by veggie, of what makes sense. For my collards, same. Next week, I'm going to harvest all of these collards. I'm going to go ahead and put a round 2 in just to get the most production of those nice young collard leaves for the rest of the season. My cabbage, I've already gone in and replaced it with the round 2. I've got the purple cabbage here and then the green cabbage that's next to that, right? So those are our round 2 babies. So we can get 2 heads of cabbage, you know, for the space that it's been planted in, okay? We've got some radishes coming in here very nicely. We've got some arugula. Now I love harvesting arugula. Arugula is so fun because you just take the whole bunch, snip it at the base. I say leave enough left so that the sunlight can hit it, okay? See this little bunch that's left behind? That arugula will grow back up to 5 times or more. Simply wonderful. Arugula is so much fun that way. Here's our celery. Oh my gosh, we've been harvesting so much celery. We're down to our last bunch, and so that's going to get harvested and replanted next week. Our sugar snap peas, these are so wonderful. Just come in, snip it, and eat it right out of the garden. So sweet and delicious. I love it. So we're harvesting from our sugar snaps, our radishes. Now carrots, it's really important because we're at that time of the season where if you don't replant your carrots now, you're going to run out of time before the spring, right? Because we do our spring replanting typically in March. So what we're doing is we're harvesting all of our carrots. Now, let's remember though, it's so important in square foot gardening that even if this is not your week to fertilize the rest of the garden, when you harvest your square foot, see, we just harvested this square foot of carrots here. When you harvest your square foot, you need to make sure that you add those nutrients back in before you seed, because in square foot gardening, after the stalks of these carrots start to grow, it's kind of hard to get back in there and provide enough nutrients for those carrots to grow as much as they need to. So getting this good dose of nutrients right here in the beginning is super important. So I have my trusty fertilizer here, and then I'm just doing my sprinkle and sprinkle, doing my 2 tablespoons per square foot, because that is what is directed for my fertilizer, but may not be right for what your fertilizer calls for. So I'm trying not to disturb these carrots that are planted behind, but I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna work this into the soil really well. So important. And you know, we're not fertilizing for these seeds we're about to plant. Seeds don't need nutrients, a lot of nutrients, in order to sprout or to germinate. But what we are doing, first of all, we want to break up some of these roots that were left behind by the last batch of carrots. So we're going down deep in there, right? Second of all, we want to get all those nutrients that we just added into the garden really nicely mixed in there, okay? Good. And then I'm going to just give it a little spritz so that when we do our seeding, it's already been slightly pre-moistened. Now, 16 per square foot is 4 rows of 4. Now, usually we've got some irrigation lines and things like that that we need to work around, but it's pretty simple to do. So I'm going to go ahead and make my holes here. Now, the depth of the hole at which you seed is directly proportional to the size of the seeds that you're using. Carrot seeds are very small, so I'm only doing about 1/4 inch deep, and the way I judge that is basically a fingernail, okay? So 1/4 inch deep, and 16 carrots in a square foot is 4 rows of 4. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll squeeze our last row right into here. And if you can imagine the carrot growing there, that's the perfect size for it to be able to take up the appropriate amount of space in the garden. And then I'll seed 1 or 2 seeds per hole. We have our trusty carrot seeds, and I try to always make sure my hands are pretty clean when I'm dealing with the seeds. I mean, come on, we are out in the garden after all. But I just don't like getting extra soil back into my seed packet. Now you'll see what I mean at how tiny these carrot seeds are, okay? So that's why we're only about 1/4 inch deep. Now carrot seeds sprout really well. So I'm just gonna do 2 per hole. The reason I'm doing 2 is just to make sure we get at least 1, but if we get both of them, we'll come back through and we'll thin it out to just 1 seed. So I will keep on seeding that later on, but you get the idea. Cover it up gently, okay, with a little bit of soil, and then within 8 weeks for these babies, these are the Yaya variety, which is a nice sweet variety. It's also a little bit heat tolerant, which is so important for our region, right? In about 8 weeks, we'll have some wonderful carrots to harvest, okay? And then, of course, the last step is to water that in very gently, because we gave it some water right before we started as well. All right. Moving on in the garden, we have our Gold Cherries over here that are doing just great this season. Again, another wonderful cherry tomato. The sweetest tomato that I've ever had. Just so delicious. Now, here's my Roma, and we're doing the same thing with the Roma that we did with the beefsteak. So we're gonna come in here, and the largest tomatoes, I am gonna go ahead and harvest and let them ripen in up to 2 weeks on the countertop. Another reason that I'm doing that is to give the whole plant a break. It is spending so much energy trying to ripen this tomato while it's under stress from the cold that it's really kind of halting everything. So we're going to relieve some of that burden from the plant. We're going to relieve some of the stress by allowing it to just ripen on the countertop And that's another reason why we do that. And then you'll see after you harvest 50%, as long as it stayed relatively warm, which is like cold, the coldest in the 60s at night rather than the 50s, then the rest of the tomatoes will just start ripening on the plant. You wouldn't have had to add any other nutrients or anything like that because it was never a nutrient issue to begin with. Oh, and I love that my Italian roasting peppers are starting to turn red. We've got a huge harvest of those coming up. Our lovely calendula, we just harvested an entire bunch of the bok choy, and then the jalapenos are continuing to produce pretty much non-stop. So that's what we've got going on out in the garden today. Thank you for joining me. I hope you learned some good tips about harvesting and planting round 2 veggies. I'm Amber Harmon with Sun Gold Gardens, helping you grow your own.